Post-colonial states often found themselves in difficult positions after independence. The rapid transfer of political authority from the colonial state to the post-colonial government tested the new administrative features of the state. Many developing countries, particularly those subject to indirect rule, found themselves with poorly developed administrative and political institutions. They often lacked trained bureaucrats capable of implementing public policy. And while the political leaders of the Global South were aware of the challenges they would face after independence, they could not be prepared for the innumerable political and economic difficulties they would be forced to confront. Today I want to outline several of these difficulties. We should remember that the nature of the liberation movement often influenced the challenges faced by the post-colonial state. Indeed, we can identify two groups of countries depending upon the nature of their liberation struggle. In the first, liberation was achieved largely through non-violent means. While those demanding their independence often faced harassment, beatings, torture, jail, and countless other punishments, the nature of the liberation struggle itself was largely non-violent. We can think of India, Botswana, or Ghana in this group of countries. In each case, a protracted movement for independence took place, often stretching off more than 50 years, but there was no generalized outbreak of violence. Independence was largely achieved through negotiated agreement between the colonizing country and the newly independent government. In the second group, violence played a central role in the liberation struggle, even if the final outcome of independence was achieved through negotiation. Examples here might include Vietnam, Algeria, Angola, Mozambique, and Zimbabwe. In the earlier phase of colonialism, we could also add Mexico or Brazil to this list. In this second group, the decolonization movement took the form of direct, violent confrontation between the colonizing power and those struggling for independence. Often this conflict was intensified or exacerbated by the Cold War, with the United States and the Soviet Union often arming one side or the other. In the early phase of decolonization, which took place in the early part of the 20th century, primarily in Latin America, Spain fought to retain control of its colonies. The Spanish-American Wars of Independence, which lasted from 1808 to 1833, encompassed the struggle for liberation of most of the New World. The Mexican War of Independence, for example, celebrated by the Diego Rivera mural painted here, lasted from 1810 to 1821. By its conclusion, Spain had lost control of Mexico, and Mexico ultimately became a republic. The conclusion of hostilities across much of the New World resulted in independence for most Spanish colonies, including Chile, Paraguay, Peru, and Venezuela. Brazil similarly achieved independence from Portugal following a short war of independence in that country. The second period of liberation wars began after World War II and continued into the 1970s. These struggles largely centered on efforts by France and Portugal to retain possession of their colonies in Africa and Southeast Asia. But in the context of the Cold War, independence movements were often able to garner political and military support from the superpowers, most often the Soviet Union. Thus we see Portugal, supported by the United States, fighting against liberation forces supported by the Soviet Union in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau. Similarly, in Vietnam, we see French and later the United States forces fighting against Soviet and later Chinese-backed Vietnam forces. These struggles, not surprisingly, left an indelible mark on the post-colonial state. In most cases, economic activity was devastated. The wars disrupted local agricultural production and displaced people both internally and externally, as well as undermining domestic markets. And the toll on human life was incalculable. According to one estimate, some 50,000 Angolans, 6,000 Guineans, and 60,000 Mozambicans were killed in the liberation wars with Portugal, which itself lost 8,000 soldiers. Estimates of the liberation war casualties against France were slightly higher. In Algeria, estimates range from 400,000 to 1.5 million dead. In Vietnam, estimates range from 125,000 to 300,000 civilian deaths and at least 175,000 Vietnamese soldiers killed. And that's before the start of U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. Violent struggles for liberation also left a political mark. Henning Melber, a German political scientist and member of the Southwest African People's Organization, or SWAPO, which fought a protracted war against South Africa for Namibia's independence. In his analysis of armed liberation struggles in Angola, Mozambique, Namibia, South Africa, and Zimbabwe, a common pattern emerges, namely, that the culture of resistance within the liberation movements themselves frequently undermined the democratic nature of the post-independence government. According to Melber, the secrecy, steadfast loyalty, often to the point of being willing to die for the liberation cause, and most importantly, the framing of politics as a simple binary of us versus them, or friend versus foe, did not facilitate democratic governance after independence. Rather, it led to political and policy differences between groups being framed as the government versus the opposition, and the opposition itself being framed as anti-liberation. Melber's thesis appears to hold true in many post-colonial states. Party and state have frequently become conflated. Those who oppose the party in power also oppose the state. Democratic political transitions become difficult, if not impossible. Opponents are often demonized as traitors to democracy and development, and compromise becomes impossible. In Zimbabwe, for example, President Robert Mugabe has frequently framed those Zimbabweans who oppose his rule as provocateurs complicit with foreign governments, and regularly accuses the British and the Americans of interfering with domestic affairs of Zimbabwe. For all post-colonial states, regardless of the method by which they achieved their independence, the challenge of constructing a new political order and new political system was paramount. The artificial nature of the post-colonial boundaries, which we'll discuss a bit later, presented problems with respect to the sovereignty of the post-colonial state. In international politics, sovereignty is defined as the right to rule over a specific territory and is thought of as the defining feature of statehood. In practice, sovereignty involves three interrelated elements. First, it encompasses the actual exercise of political authority over a territory. Does a state have the capacity to exercise control? Importantly, third world countries often lack this capacity to varying degrees. Sovereignty also encompasses an external dimension, usually expressed through the recognition of other states or through membership in the United Nations. This dimension is often referred to as external or juridical sovereignty. Finally, sovereignty also overlaps with the idea of legitimacy and the right to rule. Is a government's right to rule accepted by the people over which it presides? As you can probably already see, these three elements of sovereignty are not always present in the developing world. In the most dramatic examples, such as those of Somalia or Afghanistan, some elements of sovereignty may be lacking entirely. Throughout much of the 1990s, for example, Somalia had no government operating within the country. Between 1991 and 2012, the official Somali government, the one recognized by the United Nations, was based in neighboring Kenya and exercised virtually no sovereignty over Somali territory. Inside, Somalia was governed by militias and warlords, who exercised actual control over various parts of the country, and who often attacked international shipping in the Straits of Hormuz, but who were not recognized as the legitimate government of the people of Somalia by either the international community or the Somali people. The frequent lack of strong political institutions also gave rise to a particular form of politics. In Latin America, politics often took on a clientelist framework. Under clientelism, political parties distributed benefits, especially to the poor, in exchange for their electoral support. In Venezuela, for example, the government of Hugo Chavez undertook massive housing programs, building new apartments to house thousands of former shantytown dwellers. Such policies developed broad support for Chavez, particularly among Venezuela's poor. but it also undermines the development of political institutions rooted in broader claims of equity, efficiency, or fairness. In Africa, a particular form of clientelism, usually referred to as neo-patrimonialism, emerged. In neo-patrimonial systems, formal political structures are supplanted by informal patron-client relationships, usually operating on the basis of an ethnicity or village identity. Political leaders use their office to convey material benefits, roads, sewage, telephone access, and so on, to loyal clients. As with clientelism, such practices undermine the formal positions and bureaucratic structures of the state, replacing them with informal relations and networks more subject to change. Systems of personal relations supplant the public. Obedience is to the individual or to the party and not to the state or the office. The contest for political office thus becomes a winner-take-all system under which the victor distributes the spoils to his or her supporters, while the loser and their supporters are excluded. This distribution of benefits under both clientelism and neo-patrimonialism often facilitated rent-seeking behavior, corruption in everyday parlance. But before we get too excited about the problem of corruption in developing countries, it's important to keep a couple of things in mind. Rent-seeking is the technical term for any attempt to receive payment or material benefits by manipulating the social or political environment rather than by creating wealth. The most common example is bribery. It's important to remember that not all countries are equally subject to such practices, and there is considerable variation in the level of corruption and rent-seeking between countries. Botswana, for example, undertook a massive campaign to stamp out corruption in the 1990s. The government established an anti-corruption commission, established codes of conduct for elected and appointed government officials, and set up toll-free phone lines and billboards advertising them. It's important also to situate these practices in broader international and historical contexts. Until the passage of the Pendleton Act in 1883, most political offices in the United States were distributed according to the spoils system, which rewarded political supporters with government jobs. It took the assassination of President James Garfield in 1881 to spur changes to that system and to make most government positions merit-based appointments. Yet even today, many U.S. ambassadors are political appointees who receive their ambassadorship as a reward for effective political fundraising. When President Barack Obama was elected, 32 of the 58 ambassadorial appointments he made were to large campaign contributors. Unless you think Obama was an anomaly, 15 of President George W. Bush's ambassadors were responsible for campaign donations of at least $100,000. The tradition of clientelism and rent-seeking, it seems, is alive and well in the U.S. Foreign Service.